class. My project today is about disability discrimination in schools. So my thesis for this project is that there is discrimination in schools in relation to disabled students, and this is due to a general lack of funding, the fact that schools are unable to provide disabled students with all the resources they need, which include interpreters, wheelchair accessible buildings, buses, and also additional special education instructors. And because of this, students are not able to succeed in the ways that match able-bodied students, and so are falling behind. Now, the UN has a wonderful statement about the importance of education, in which they say that basic education reduces poverty and it contributes to economic growth, and it also builds the kind of behaviors and habits that have a positive impact on an individual's health. And so children who complete basic education eventually become parents who are more capable of providing quality care for their own children. Now, for disabled students, it's also very important that they use the tool, which is school, because while children with obvious congenital, physical, or sensory disabilities are likely to have been already identified and been served within the healthcare system before they start school, many disabilities, particularly learning disabilities, behavioral disorders, and developmental delays, may not be identified until a child begins school. And so it is in that particular social environment where a teacher is watching them, where there's learning to be had, that these different disabilities may be apparent. So in a grand scale, there is definitely a lot of concern about education for disabled children. In fact, the UN put out a big 124-page report that's called The Right of Children with Disabilities to Education, along with just comprehensive statistical analyses that they've put out. But the difference is that this paper and a lot of these things are focused about still like destigmatizing disability. One of the chapters within The Right of Children with Disabilities to Education is about institutionalization and trying to fight against it because all the evidence supports that it's not good. And so how that differs from the US is because the US actually has policies that protect disabled people, that also protect disabled children within schools. And so I'll go into more detail about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, along with the IDEA, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that came out 2 years later. And just as a little refresher, the ADA, which is Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, is an act that protects disabled people from having access to outside spaces, federal buildings, businesses, and it also has had some amendments, first in 2008, which adds some rules to the Section 504, along with 2024, actually this April, there was an amendment which made sure that all sources on the website, so in schools, that everything that had to do with the internet was also accessible to every disabled student. So, what is Section 504? So this covers qualified students with disabilities who attend schools receiving federal financial assistance. And that's what that ADA amendment in 2008 actually changed. It changed it to every school in the country, regardless of federal financial assistance. They all have to protect students who are determined to have either a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. They have to have a record of an impairment or be regarded as having such an impairment. And so how Section 504 plays out is that in schools, if you're having difficulty focusing or you may have a learning disability, including dyslexia or ADHD, or you can't study in a busy classroom, you can have extra time on tests, you can have assistive technology, you can ask for homework or assignments to be modified, you can have access to interpreters, and all of this will focus on the accommodations for students rather than necessarily specific teachers, instructors, personnel for these kids. And so usually they call them 504 plans if you've ever had to need one. Perhaps if you've had a mental health crisis and you're falling behind, this would be enacted to help you get on track so that you are able to succeed in school. And now this difference from the IDEA is that IDEA it makes available eligible students with disabilities throughout the nation, and so ensures special education and related services to those children. And so that looks like special education classes where it's from age 3 to age 21 that these people are allowed to be in schools and receive free education. These are people with learning disabilities, developmental disabilities, physical disabilities. And so this is where we see speech pathology come into play, and a school psychologist, all of these additives to a school environment that's not just your teacher. So all of these help to make sure that these kids are also succeeding. So if I'm arguing that funding is changing, where does funding come from for schools? And most of it comes from property taxes within a county or a district of a school district, and only 10% of all school funding comes from the federal level, which is the federal government. And so this tends to change how much money is being given to schools or how much can be allocated when property values fall, like how they did in the Great Recession, which happened around 2008. There was less money to be spent on schools. So here's a little graph that shows a bit of that. And so in 1995, the federal government was spending about $637 per student. The peak was actually in 2010, which probably follows right after, because property taxes fell, and so locally they were not getting as much money from their state district from their property taxes, and so the government helped out. And at that time they were spending $1,600 per child within school, and in 2015 it's about 1,000. And so we don't have data for the 9 years in between, but it can be assumed that this either maintained or slightly varied, which is why this graph is also, I think, important to look at. So on our left is a graph that shows how Utah compares to the US level of federal funding, and this is more for per capita as like the price is more bigger. And that is compared right next to a graph that shows Vermont spending. So this is levels that show in the local governments how they compare to other states. Utah is below average of all of them, while Vermont has different state laws that change how the funding goes to schools. And so it will be interesting to see in the next couple years, because it was voted into law this past election that some of our money of our taxes would go to education, how potentially Utah could have a little bit more spending in terms of our public education. So, has there been discrimination for disabled students? Yes, in that students are not able to succeed in as much. And why we think that this is and how we know this is because IDA has reached an all-time high within the last school year, 2022 to 2023. With 7.5 million students helped, which brings the amount of students within the school, 15% of them are receiving this help. And the reason we think this number has increased so much and why it's so high is mostly because the biggest chunk of that pie, of that percentage, are students with learning disabilities, which accounts for 32%. And also the added visibility and accessibility of learning about different learning disabilities, right? Of learning how your kid may different from another kid, and also advocating for it and not being embarrassed or shy to ask for your school to help them. And also why these numbers are significantly higher than they were in 2019 to 2020 is because of the COVID shutdown. And it is understood within the education sphere that when 2020, when schools shut down, a lot of kids fell behind because they weren't paying attention or they didn't have access to technology. And so when that transition occurred coming back to school, those kids were already behind. And so in the last 3-4 years that they've been coming back to school, we're finally kind of able to see what kids actually did have learning disabilities who were falling behind, not because of the circumstances, but because of their own issues, to be imprecise. But so all of those kids that should have been diagnosed or put onto an IDA 3 years ago are now all being put on now because it's understood that that's what they need. So ultimately, how does this all affect disabled students? We know that disabled students are falling behind and are not succeeding in the same ways as able-bodied students because they have lower graduation rates. They also do not pursue higher education, as in colleges, universities, that are equal to their classmates. And overall, they just don't do as well in the classroom. And this could be because of social stigma, the fact that they are disabled living in an able-bodied society, that they are constantly having to self-advocate for themselves for help, and that just may be exhausting. But ultimately, I do think that it comes down to this increase of diagnoses of more kids are receiving these plans, of wanting to help these more kids, and the money just not being there, that they don't have enough money to hire more teachers, more special educators, more like specific people to help with all of these problems. And so, in this way, in conclusion, these students are falling behind because of all of it. And that's something that needs to be on people's mind moving forward, is that every child deserves to be educated, every child deserves to have the same opportunities. And if we are treating a large portion of the school population as different and less than, then we're going to see that effect in a couple of years in a really disastrous way. So, hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Bye.